This is the Learn Piano in Your Car podcast 32. Today I am considering some questions I have seen about people memorising music. Particularly people who have only played 8 or 9 months and can play quite well. I've seen the videos of them playing, but their question is along the lines of, I have memorised this piece, but I want to learn to read and my reading is pretty rubbish. How can I read better? And the answer to that, in my opinion, is don't memorise the pieces. Now, I understand that some people will find that quite hard because it's a habit that you've got into memorising the pieces. But how about you just switch it? So if you're good at memorising, you should be able to learn to read music easily, because you need, first of all, to memorise the notes on the treble clef and the bass clef. You need to memorise the notes on the keyboard by shape, the 7 white, memorising them by shape and proximity to the black notes. When you get a bit further into your music, you'll need your memory to identify intervals and patterns in the music. But first of all, you need to learn what those intervals and patterns are. You need to learn the different types of notes and groupings of notes. For example, a common grouping is a quaver grouped with 2 semiquavers. We say beamed. So a quaver attached to 2 semiquavers by a beam across the top. So that's a common group. That group, the 3 notes in it, add up to 1 beat. So isn't it worth memorising these things? Memorise what an octave looks like on sheet music. Memorise your finger numbers. Memorise the pattern of a scale. Memorise the pattern of a tonic triad and a first inversion and a second inversion. There's so many things that if you're good at memorising, you can utilise that skill far better than by memorising a piece of music. Memorising a piece of music, in my experience, or I would advise, is damaging. When you play from sheet music, you should be able to keep your eyes on the music at least 90% of the time, I would say. And you're following the music. And your fingers are doing their thing because you've taught them what to do. You've taught them and built up muscle memory, which is memorising again. But to jump straight to playing a piece of music and memorising it, you're cutting out, you're missing out, and you're damaging yourself, your future learning, because you're just putting all of that theory to the side, which is actually essential for reading from sheet music. So here's the thing, if you've learned to play so far and you can read a little bit so you can memorise, if you can read a little bit from sheet, but your favoured way to learn is to read it from the sheet music, work it all out and then memorise it bit by bit, I want you to stop that and I want you to force yourself to keep your eye on the music and not look at your fingers. You want your eyes on the music at least 90% of the time. You're only looking at your fingers if you've got to, if your hand's in this position that you can see if you're watching this. If you are indeed listening in the car, I've got 5 fingers on 5 side-by-side notes. And my brain knows what those notes are. I don't need to look at my fingers to know that my fingers are on C, D, E, F, G. So if I'm following the sheet music and it's these 5 notes, that's fine. I don't need to look at my fingers because I know they're on those notes. If you've done scales and arpeggios, you get used to moving your hand about the keys. So if I had to move my hand to a different position, for example, my thumb now needs to be on G, then, or F or G, then I simply tuck my thumb under and move it to that note. I don't need to look because I've practiced the scales and arpeggios. I now know that my hand is in the position with my thumb on F. Therefore, my brain knows my other fingers are on G, A, B, C. But that's because I've spent the time to build up the muscle memory to map out the keyboard in my brain. I physically don't need to look at it to know where my fingers are, as long as they're on certain anchor points. And that is a reason why we try to make sure our fingers are touching notes at all times. If you take your fingers off the notes and then put them back down, you can't be certain you've actually put them back down where your brain thinks they should be without looking. So there's loads of ways for you to use your memory skills other than memorising the music. You're selling yourself short if you do that. Trust me, there is so much you could learn. Let me just have a quick look in here. You can learn, there is a pattern for every major scale. And when I say pattern, I mean in terms of whole tones and semitones. There's a pattern for every minor scale. You need to learn the key signatures. These are all things that you need to memorise so that you just glance. If I looked at a piece of sheet music, I could tell you the time signature and what it means, the key signature and what that means in terms of white and black notes. And I can look at the rhythm. Like for example, on this piece of sheet music, there you go. You can see all the different rhythms. Well, I've memorised all those patterns over the years. Patterns of, as I said before, 1 quaver beamed, which is joined, to 2 semiquavers. I know that's 1 beat and I know what that rhythm sounds like in the music. And there's lots more. For example, 4 semiquavers joined together, beamed together, is 1 beat. And again, I know what that sounds like in terms of rhythm because I've memorised it, I've learned it. So put your brain into thinking about memorising those things, then you don't need to memorise the sheet music. And it frees you up because instead of being able to play a couple of pieces of music that you've memorised, then eventually you'll be able to play any piece of sheet music at all. So isn't it worth putting the time in at the beginning to get the payoff later on? I think so. Okay, I'm Carol Brotherston. Send me any questions that you have to info@themusicroom.org.uk and I will answer them in this podcast. Thanks for listening.